Okay, today we're making kind of a meatloaf. That's what the mainland would call it. It's my own personal recipe. It's Chong Burger. I developed it when I was in the military, and I just happened to use whatever was at hand. So we usually start out with a quantity of ground beef. I got about a pound here, and then every ingredient has a purpose. Okay, so you could just make for basic meatloaf. You could just use uh, hamburger, breadcrumbs. Uh, Onions are optional, and then you add a little milk or cream, and that would give you your basic recipe. Salt, pepper to taste. Okay. Um, in Hawaii or in my travels, I found that pretty much putting everything in, people find that it's a different, it's not what they're used to, and so it's something new to them, and they know it's different, so they go along with it, and a lot of them tend to enjoy it. So this is after about 30 years of creating this recipe and making changes here and there. I like a lot of onions. I'm in this case I'm using sweet onions. Before I used to use a lot of yellow onions. I find that people who don't like onions, especially the yellow ones, it tends to be too sharp. Uh, so what I do is I use sweet onions, and it's not as strong. Okay, or you can omit the onions altogether. Okay, so the main idea with making a meatloaf style hamburger patty or meatloaf itself is you want to stretch this meat so that you can feed more people. And the way you do that is you add either chopped up bread. You can use stale bread, make it into breadcrumbs in a blender. I'm using a prepackaged seasoned breadcrumbs. You can use plain breadcrumbs if you don't care for, in this case, the Italian flavor. So whatever you have at hand, and I have all these items. Soy sauce. I'm using Lowry salt or whatever your favorite seasoning salt. Worcestershire sauce, and again we're going to stretch it out using either cream. I'm going to use milk in this case, and then whenever you stretch out a lot of things, you need something to bind it back together. Normally, if you're just cooking a hamburger, the hamburger proteins will bind it back together. But in this case, since we're going to be adding breadcrumbs, you can go as high as 40% breadcrumbs. So if you're putting in a pound of meat, you could use up to half a pound to 2/3 of a pound of, well, that's a lot. I would say maybe a whole cup of breadcrumbs. Japanese style, they tend to use a lot of breadcrumbs and a lot of ketchup. Okay, so it's more of a meat with bread in their version. My version kind of encompasses everybody. Whether you're from the mainland, Hawaii, or Japan, you tend to, this is acceptable. Okay, so start out with about a pound of ground beef, and break it up. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and add, like I like onions. You can omit this, and then the breadcrumbs. Okay, now depending on how dry this gets. Okay, so as you can see, the breadcrumbs already disappeared. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add more. So let me pour it out here so you can see how much I'm adding. I'm going to go a pretty generous amount. You don't have to add this much. But like I said, the whole purpose of this is to stretch out the meat, because you know you're short meat, or you're feeding more people. Okay. Now what's going to happen is, with this much dry bread in here, or if you have chopped up bread, you're going to notice it falls apart. Okay, and this is where to add a binder, I'm going to add an egg, and then I'm going to ahead and add all my other sauces and liquids at this time, and it'll get absorbed into the so I'm going to add a splash of milk to give it more moisture. That's about a quarter cup. Okay, generous amount of pepper. And like I said, everything, whatever you got handy. A splash of Worcestershire sauce. Okay. And we'll hold off on the salt till later. Okay. And I'm gonna, since local style, add a little soy. And then garlic. It's always good with beef. And then ketchup. As you can see, I don't have a ketchup bottle. Ran out. Okay, actually I'm gonna open this bag too. You can really put a lot of ketchup in this. I find that a lot of people like a heavy amount of ketchup. But that's up to you, okay? You can always add ketchup after, especially if you're making meatloaf. You can always add ketchup. Like you can layer the top with ketchup, like a layer of ketchup, and then when you cook it, it makes a kind of like a ketchup crust. Okay, and then what we're gonna do is combine all the ingredients. You can always use a spatula, or it's just easier. When I was working in the meat industry, making hamburger patties and stuff like that, we found that by mixing it thoroughly, you bring out the proteins in the meat, and it does make for a tougher hamburger. So if you want a loose hamburger, you don't mix it as much, but then it gets to the point where the hamburger literally falls apart. So we already know that this will be a loose hamburger because of all the liquid in it. And the eggs will help keep it together. So we want to increase the, the binding power of the meat by hand mixing it. And also, it'll turn a uniform color. Okay. And as you can see, all the breadcrumbs absorbed all the liquid. Okay, so this is adequate. Okay, and all you do when you're making patties, you just use a spoon, or you grab an amount that you want, the size that you want, and then you just pat it down. And you just transfer it, just like you're making mud pies, okay? And you can use your thumb to squeeze the edges, depending on how good your mud pie making is. And then you keep patting it down. And you want it kind of a rough shape because you want it to look more rustic, more homemade, old-fashioned style. Okay, so this is a patty. I would say that's close to a quarter pounder. Okay, you can see how thick it is. Now, the thicker you make it, the longer it's going to take to cook. But I find that if you have it thick, like this size is a good size, it's nice and juicy. It'll plump up and shrink, and then it'll be nice and juicy. If you want more bun coverage, you're gonna have to make it flatter and with more meat. Now, another thing you can do is you can make, this is a good recipe for making meatballs. You just take a small amount, like a heaping tablespoon, or you can make smaller ones, and then you just roll them into balls. Okay. Now, if you find that the onions are too big, then just cover them up because they'll just fall out when you cook the meatballs. Now, when you fry the hamburger, you can fry the meatballs in with the pan if you have room, and then just lightly fry them. Because what will you do is you let them cool off later, and you put them away, and then when you have your favorite spaghetti recipe, all you do is, it's already cooked, or at least mostly the way it cooked, and then you just drop it in your spaghetti sauce. See, like I got that onion sticking out, just stick it in there. You got spaghetti sauce, you just drop it in the spaghetti sauce and cook it all the way through. it'll stay together. If you leave it raw and you put it in the sauce when it's raw, the meatball will tend to fall apart. Well, that's okay too, because then you have spaghetti with meat sauce, right? So either way, you end up eating it. Goes all in the same place. Okay, so I'm just making little balls that I'll fry, and I'll save it later for after I cook them. I'll put it in a container. You can freeze it up to 3 months, or just use it if you know you're gonna make spaghetti later. So let's make another patty with this. Okay, if you're making a meatloaf, you would take the typical rectangular tray, and then you would take all this meat and pack it in nice and tight, all in the tray, the rectangular tray, and you can top it with ketchup and then bake it. You can use a meat thermometer. You want to bake it say at 325 for at least 30 to 45 minutes, but you can tell the meat will shrink up on the sides. I'll show you in a later video. Okay, let's make a patty out of this, because I know our son wants a cheeseburger. So that's it. Okay, and then you just toss it in a pan, fry it on both sides, and you got it done.